here live from the Museum of the Rockies today with Dr. John Scannella, our curator of paleontology. I'm Jamie Augst, the museum's outreach program manager. I'll be your MC. You'll hear me kind of off the camera, and I'll talk to you in front of the camera a little bit today. Our friends and partners at Streamable Learning are also on hand, so if you come across any IT issues, type those into the chat box, let them know, and we'll do our best to get you back online as fast as we can. Any questions you have throughout the program today, feel free to type those into the chat box as well. We'll either answer them immediately or by the end of the program. So thanks for your patience in advance. Have any of you out there ever been to the Museum of the Rockies? Anyone from Montana? Maybe not. That's okay, because we're going to show you where we're at. We are in Bozeman, Montana, like I mentioned. We're about 80 miles, there we are, north of Yellowstone National Park, and 315 miles south of our neighbors in Canada. We are in the beautiful and historic Gallatin Valley on the campus of Montana State University. There we are. That's our museum. Anyone know what kind of dinosaur greets us as we walk in? Take your best guess, even if you don't know. All right, I'm going to tell you, that's Big Mike. He is a T-Rex. As we walk in the museum, we're going to see a couple more dinosaurs. There he is again. That looks a lot like today. Sunny and snowy and beautiful out there. Here's our Siebel dinosaur complex. We're going to head through, taking a look at an Allosaurus there in the front, a Brontosaurus, and a Plesiosaur way in the back. I'm going to keep going to our hall of horns and teeth. We have a Triceratops and a T-Rex. I'm not going to pretend to know much about dinosaurs. We have Dr. Scannella here. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. I'm John Scannella, and I am a paleontologist, which is a scientist that studies ancient life long ago. Now, if we wanted to study what life is like around us today, it's relatively straightforward. In many cases, we can just take a look or in other ways observe what kind of plants and animals are around us today. But if you were interested in what life was like long ago, there might be some challenges to learning more about ancient life, because first we would need to, in a way, go back in time to observe ancient life. So imagine for a moment that you have a time machine, and you can get into your time machine and travel all the way back to yesterday. Now, if you got out of your time machine in yesterday and looked around at the plants and animals, they probably wouldn't be very different from the plants and animals you can see around you today. But if you could then take your time machine back several thousand years, then you might notice perhaps some substantial differences between what kind of plants and animals were around where you are today and what it looks like right now. And so that, in a way, is kind of part of what paleontologists do. We attempt to, in a way, go back through time and observe, study, and explore ancient life on the planet to figure out what it was like and how it's changed through time. But since we don't have a time machine, we have to use the Earth as a sort of a time machine. And so paleontologists often work closely together with scientists called geologists, who are scientists that study the Earth and its processes. And geologists have put together the geologic timescale, which I have a version of here today. So this is basically sort of like a calendar, but instead of showing the days of the week or the months of the year, it shows the history and prehistory of the Earth. So here we are today. This is kind of the present day at the top. And as we go down through these layers of different times, we can go all the way down to the origins of the Earth over 4.5 billion years ago. And so today we're going to be talking a bit about the evolution of dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are usually thought to be found in this area here, the Mesozoic Era, which is sometimes called the Age of Dinosaurs. And if we want to study dinosaurs from this time, since we can't just look at them walking around, we have to study what are known as fossils. Fossils are one of the main things that paleontologists use to study life of the past. And fossils are basically just the preserved remains of living things found in the earth. I have some examples of fossils here today. Here's one. This is the lower jaw of a duck-billed dinosaur. So you can see kind of the shape of the jaw. Here's teeth in the jaw right there. And so this is a dinosaur that lived here in Montana in the late Cretaceous period over 75 million years ago. At the same place where this duck-billed dinosaur jaw was found, another kind of fossil was discovered. This is another remainder of a living thing. This might look familiar to you if I hold it there. Any idea what kind of fossil this might be?
Let us know what you think. All guesses are welcome.
Yes.
Type it on in there.
Any guesses on what this is the fossil of? It was found at the same place as the duck-billed dinosaur. Any guesses?
Our friends from New York say an egg.
Oh, that's a good guess. It's not a fossil egg, though it does kind of look like one. It's actually a fossil pine cone, which is kind of neat. So paleontologists, we can study not only the remains of ancient animals, but also plants. We can learn about what ancient ecosystems were like and how they changed through time. But before we can pick up something like this fossil pine cone and study it in the lab, we have to be able to go out and find fossils out in the field. And so in order to do that, we need to go to places where the right age rock is exposed at the surface. So say, for example, that you were interested in finding the fossils of a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a Triceratops. These animals lived at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 66 million years ago, right about here. So to find their fossils, we would need to go to places where rocks of that age are at the surface of the earth, and then we could look for fossils there. Luckily, some geologists have put together maps of the surface of the earth, like this one here. Which I think you can kind of see. This is a geologic map of the state of Montana, made by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology in Butte. And basically, all these different colors that you can see over Montana, these are different geologic formations at the surface of the earth, basically different aged rocks at the surface. And so if we're looking for, say, a Triceratops or a T-Rex from this time, 66 or so million years ago, on this map, that time is this light green color. You can see is exposed in places around eastern Montana. And so if we can go to the next slide, Jamie, we can take a look at what it looks like when we kind of fly over one of these areas in eastern Montana. And that is a view of one of these spots in what's known as the Hell Creek Formation. And the Hell Creek Formation is the geologic unit that represents the very end of the age of dinosaurs in Montana. And as you look out over this part of the Hell Creek Formation, you can see that there's a lot of exposure of rocks. So not only is the right age rock at the surface, but also it's not covered up by things like parking lots or buildings. There are places on Earth where the right age rock might be at the surface, but it might be covered up by streets and things. So that's one of the reasons why Montana is a great place to find fossils of dinosaurs, especially Cretaceous dinosaurs. So if we go to the next slide, please, we'll see that every summer we go out, field crews from the Museum of the Rockies go out and explore and make discoveries of dinosaurs and other ancient creatures. Here you can see some excavations occurring. These white blobby structures, you can see those are called field jackets. So basically, once a fossil is uncovered, we will wrap it up in layers of burlap and plaster, kind of like a cast. And that's basically so that it can be safely transported back to the museum. If we go to the next slide, we'll see what happens once we get the fossils back to the museum. They go to our fossil preparation labs, where fossil preparators are the people who open up the field jackets and then carefully remove the rock that has encased the bone for millions of years. And on this slide, in the lower left-hand part, you can see part of the jaw of a big Triceratops that's being removed from the rock. And on the lower right, those are two horns of a Triceratops that are being taken out of the field jacket in the lab. And so once the fossils are prepped in the lab, we can take a look at them. So here's an example here. This is the dentary, part of the lower jaw of a Triceratops. And this was discovered in eastern Montana. It was excavated, it was wrapped in a field jacket of layers of burlap and plaster so it could be safely transported back to the museum. It was brought here, it was opened up, the fossil preparators carefully removed it from the rock, and now we can take a look at what this Triceratops jaw looks like and perhaps compare it with the fossils of other dinosaurs in the collection. So, for example, looking at this Triceratops jaw, we can see the general shape of it and compare it with that fossil I showed you a little while ago, the lower jaw of this duck-billed dinosaur, this is a Brachylophosaurus. And you can see that there's some similarities, some shared features that they have in common. Both the duckbill and the Triceratops kind of have this process that comes off of it. There's a point where another bone can connect to the front of the jaw. So there's shared features between the duck-billed dinosaur and the Triceratops. And they have features in common which we don't see in some other dinosaurs, such as this one here. This is the skull of a Daspletosaurus horneri, which is a tyrannosaur, a cousin of Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so here's the dentary, that lower jaw bone. And if we compare it, for example, to this duckbill, we can see that there's lots of differences between the Tyrannosaur and the duckbill, and the duckbill jaw has more features in common with the Triceratops jaw. So this is one way that paleontologists might group fossil creatures together based on how many shared features they have in common. If we could pull up the next slide, please, Jamie, we'll see a simplified diagram of this kind of grouping of fossil creatures based on shared features. This is called a cladogram, and basically it's a very simple diagram where we've grouped some animals based on how many shared features they have that aren't seen in other groups. So on this cladogram, you can see that humans and dogs are grouped very closely together because humans and dogs are both mammals. Humans and dogs both have hair, babies and puppies both drink milk, and so we're grouped together as mammals. We're more similar to each other. We share more features that aren't seen in these other groups with each other. The next group down the tree, on this tree, is lizards, and they're further away from us than dogs are, but humans, dogs, and lizards also share features together. We're part of a group called amniotes, which are basically animals that could lay eggs on land or give birth to babies on land rather than having to return to the water to lay eggs. So if we come back to the live cam for a second, another way perhaps of thinking of this grouping of animals is by using these colorful cups. Perhaps you had something like this when you were little. I did. I enjoyed playing with colorful cups. But you can stack them one side of the other. And so in a similar way, we can group fossil creatures together. So you and I are both human beings. So say that's humans. But also we are mammals. So all humans are mammals. All mammals belong to that other group of amniotes. So also humans, dogs, lizards are all amniotes. We can all arose from animals that could lay eggs on land or give birth on land. But all amniotes are also vertebrates, animals with a backbone. And we can go further down the tree. So there's kind of a hierarchy of relationships based on shared features that we can see in the fossil record. And so you can kind of get more and more specific as you go up through parts of the tree. And so throughout the presentation, you might see some other cladograms show up, but basically they're just simple diagrams grouping things by shared features. Now, a few hundred years ago, some exciting discoveries were made. One of them was the fact that long ago there had been creatures alive on the planet which are no longer around. The discovery of things like woolly mammoths and the mastodon highlighted the fact that in some cases even really big animals used to be here. We can find their bones today, but we can't see them alive today. They've gone extinct. So the idea of extinction was a controversial idea at first, but now it's pretty clear that there were animals alive that are no longer around today. And then in the mid-1800s, a big focus of a lot of research and thought was the concept of evolution. And evolution very simply is change over time, or changes in populations over the course of generations. So how might this occur? How might we see one species, for example, change into another over the course of many generations? Well, one example, I think, of changes over generations that we might be able to relate to today, that might seem familiar, has to do with this animal. This is the skull of an animal that's still around today. Any idea what kind of skull, what kind of animal this is the skull of?
What do you guys think? Type it in your chat box. What kind of skull is John holding? A modern day...
Any guesses?
Wolf?
Wolf? Wolf. Very, very good. So this is the skull of a modern day wolf. And then this here is the skull of a little bulldog, you can see. And so the bulldog skull looks very different from the wolf skull, and yet the bulldog came from a wolf, or a group of wolves, through a process of people basically choosing which features they liked. So, for example, imagine you have a group of wolves, and you wanted to make smaller wolves or smaller dogs. You would first pick out the smallest wolves in the group and have them have puppies, and discourage the bigger wolves from having puppies. And then you would take the puppies of the small wolves and pick out their smallest puppies and have more puppies from these small dogs. And then as you continue this process over the course of many generations, you would be choosing the smallest wolves to have puppies to have the next generation, and then the smallest of those to pass on the trait of smallness from generation to generation, and you would be selectively kind of weeding out the bigger wolves that might appear. And by repeating that process over the course of many generations, that's how you could go from something like a wolf to something like a bulldog or a chihuahua, or if you prefer a Great Dane, or whatever other kind of dogs there are around today. This is what's called artificial selection. People have chosen the traits that they wanted to encourage to be passed on through the generations. In this example, for example, smallness. And so it's called artificial selection because the choices are being made by people. This can be contrasted with what's called natural selection, which is basically a very similar process, except instead of people choosing what traits should go on, it's a result of natural processes. So say, for example, you have a big group of wolves, and then it just, the weather changes and it gets cold for a long period of time. Within that population, there might be some wolves that have slightly thicker fur. This might allow them to better survive given the changing conditions in the environment, the colder weather. And so maybe they would have more puppies that would be able to survive as well. And so those puppies might carry with them the trait of having slightly thicker fur, and so they might have more puppies as well, whereas those wolves in the group that aren't as well suited or adapted to really cold temperatures might not have as many puppies. And so over the course of many, many generations, if it remains really cold for a long time, you might eventually start off with a population of wolves and wind up with a group that has much thicker fur and might be better adapted for life in this new cold environment. This would be an example of natural selection. And so natural selection. And so natural selection is just one of the ways in which evolution can occur. And so we will be today talking a bit about the evolution of dinosaurs, which again, dinosaurs, we're in the age of dinosaurs here in the Mesozoic Era, and they first appear in the fossil record in the Triassic Period, the beginning of the Mesozoic Era, somewhere between 230 and 250 million years ago. But we can look back through the fossil record and kind of group them with their closest relatives in the way that we've just done with a few examples here. If we could go back to that slide of the simplified cladogram for a moment. Here we are again. So again, this is just grouping things by shared features. And again, you see that humans and dogs are grouped together as mammals. And we're also grouped with lizards in a bigger group, a wider cup, called amniotes, which are creatures that can lay eggs on land. We don't have to return to the water to have babies. And so about 300 or so million years ago, three groups of amniotes appear in the fossil record. If we could go to the next slide, please, Jamie. So here's three examples of these three groups that appear in the fossil record, and we'll go through them very briefly. On the left is a skull that's called an anapsid skull, and basically you can see it has an opening there for the eye, but behind the eye there are no additional openings in the skull. In the middle, that's a skull of a synapsid, and you can see there's the opening for the eye, and then there's one opening behind the eye. And on the right is a skull called a diapsid skull, and there you see there's the eye opening, and there's two openings behind the eye. And so these three groups appear in the fossil record all around 300 or so million years ago. The anapsids are a group that's been the subject of a lot of study of what is an anapsid. The synapsids in the middle there, the group that has one opening behind the eye, that's actually the group that gave rise to mammals. So you and I are both synapsids. We can trace our ancestry back through the fossil record to something that looked like this with just one opening at the back of its skull. And on the right, the diapsid skull, that gave rise to what today we have as reptiles and their relatives. So I have some examples of diapsid skulls here, which I'll show you. If we come to the full view. So this is an example of a diapsid. Here we have a lizard skull. This is a little monitor lizard. And here's the eye there. And if we look at the back of the skull, we can see there's an opening there and another opening on the side. So it has two openings at the back of the skull, which means it's a diapsid. Here is another example of a modern diapsid. This is a crocodilian. And if you look at the crocodilian skull, here's the eye there. And then here's another opening at the back and another one. So it has two behind the eye, which also makes it a diapsid, links it with the lizard. And then this is a dinosaur skull. Here's the eye there. And then behind the eye, here's an opening there and an opening there. So two openings behind the eye. This is also a diapsid. So three diapsid skulls, but these two, the crocodilian and the dinosaur, share even more features in common with each other than they do with the lizard. And there's many throughout the skeleton, but one that you can clearly see here in the skull, there's this extra opening in the lower jaw of this crocodilian. And then, similarly, might be a little tough to see on this, but here's this opening in the lower jaw of this dinosaur. So, in a way similar to these cups again, if this is a dinosaur is an archosaur. It shares that with the crocodile, and both the dinosaur and the crocodile are diapsids, like the lizard there. So, about 230 to 250 million years ago, the first dinosaur arose. It appears in the fossil record, and again, we're back in the Triassic period. And one of the features that unites all dinosaurs, links them more closely together with each other than to other archosaurs like the crocodile, has to do with the rest of the skeleton. So here is a cast of the skeleton of a little dinosaur, a young Maiasaura, a duck-billed dinosaur. And one of the key features that's been used to group together dinosaurs has to do with the hips and the legs. This is the femur, the thigh bone. And in dinosaurs, the femur fits into a hole in the hip socket that allows it to go directly under the body. So if you've ever seen a lizard walking around, they tend to kind of sprawl their limbs out to the side, kind of a sprawling gait. And similarly, crocodilians do something similar. They can have their limbs out to the side, though sometimes they can be more upright. They can do what's called a high walk for periods of time. But dinosaurs evolved to have a hole in the hip socket that allowed their legs to go directly under their bodies. And this helped them to stand more upright than other groups of animals around at the time, or at least to achieve that through a specific way. And so that's when dinosaurs first appear in the fossil record, and one of the ways that we might recognize dinosaurs. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Jamie. In the Triassic period, we see a big diversification of different types of dinosaurs. So on this chart here, you can see down in the purple time, that's the Triassic, when dinosaur fossils begin to appear in the fossil record. And on this chart, we see that there's two major branches in the Triassic for dinosaurs, one that goes off to the right and one that goes off to the left. And basically, these two branches are based on the structure of the hip bones, which you can see little diagrams of at the bottom. Now, recently there's been some more research into these different structures of the hip bones and how closely they're related to each other, but we're going to go with examining these two major groups of dinosaurs. On the right side of the screen is the Ornithischia, the Ornithischian dinosaurs. And basically that just means that if you look at that little drawing of the hips, the bone in red, the pubis kind of curves backwards along with that other bone behind it. And this is a group that includes animals like the horned dinosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs, the plated dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, the armored dinosaurs, and the duck-billed dinosaurs and creatures like that. On the opposite side of this diagram, you can see that bone in red, the pubis goes forward instead of going backwards like the other one. And so this is the Saurischian dinosaurs, which includes things like Tyrannosaurus Rex and Velociraptor and other animals like that. So we're going to take a quick look at evolution within some groups in both of these branches of the dinosaur family tree. And one of the groups that I spend a lot of time working with sometimes is a group called the Marginocephalia, which is fun to say and basically just means dinosaurs that have a shelf of bone at the back of their head. So Marginocephalians are Ornithischian dinosaurs, so that's that group that was on the right where the hip bones both go backwards. So again, here is Maiasaura, a duck-billed dinosaur, both the hip bones go backwards. So a myosaur like this is an ornithischian dinosaur. Now, a marginocephalian example of that would be something like this creature here. This is a model of Pachycephalosaurus, one of the well-known domed dinosaurs, dome on the head. And you can see at the back of the skull, there's kind of a shelf of bone that goes backwards. And on this Pachycephalosaurus, this shelf of bone has these really big spikes and nodes and bumps all over it. So it's the shelf of bone that makes it a marginocephalian. So they're ornithischian dinosaurs with a shelf of bone at the back of the head. And they are the closest cousins of another group of marginocephalians. So one group is the Pachycephalosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs, and the other group is called the Ceratopsians. Like this one here, this is the skull of Protoceratops from the Cretaceous of Mongolia. And you can see that where in the Pachycephalosaurus, it had a little shelf of bone at the back of the head with some bumps and spikes on it. But in a Ceratopsian, like this Protoceratops, the shelf of bone becomes this really big frill at the back of the skull. So Ceratopsians are sometimes called the horned dinosaurs. Could we pull up the next slide for a second, Jamie? This is going to be another simplified cladogram looking at the group called Marginocephalia. Again, these are ornithischian dinosaurs with that shelf of bone at the back of the head. You can see the first branch that comes off is the Pachycephalosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs. And then as we go further up the tree, away from the Pachycephalosaurs, we enter a group called the Ceratopsian dinosaurs. So if we come back to this camera for a moment. So again, here's a Ceratopsian. And Ceratopsians are sometimes called the horned dinosaurs. Perhaps the most famous Ceratopsian is Triceratops, which has 3 horns on its face. But if we look at something like Protoceratops here, it doesn't really have those big pronounced horns on its face. It has kind of a bump on its nose. And some smaller examples of Ceratopsians have even less in the way of horns than that. This is the skull of a small Ceratopsian from Montana, the early Cretaceous of Montana, named the Chelops. And as you can see, it doesn't really have any horns to speak of on its face. And it's a really small little animal. It's about the size of a cat. But it, too, is a Ceratopsian dinosaur. It is a marginocephalian that is closely related to Triceratops and Protoceratops. And the feature that links them together, that makes them, that they share, that other dinosaurs don't have, isn't horns. It has to do with an extra bone in the beak at the front of the face. So this Protoceratops again, all the Ceratopsians have these kind of big beaks, and there's an extra bone on the top part of the beak called the rostral bone. And here is a cast of the rostral bone of a big Triceratops. So it kind of goes something like that, fit on there and make the top part of this parrot-like beak that all Ceratopsian dinosaurs share. So if we take a quick look, again, I have a paper copy of this simple cladogram. So Ceratopsian dinosaurs all share this extra bone of the beak, and then they evolved in various ways. There's a group here called the Leptoceratopsids, and I have a jaw, part of the jaw of a Leptoceratopsid. This is part of the lower jaw of a Leptoceratopsid named Ceratopsians, which has lived here in Montana in the Cretaceous period. Right here is the teeth in the lower jaw, and you can see that it's a really thick lower jaw. They're these massive lower jaws, which looks quite a bit different from what we see in some other horned dinosaurs, like, for example, Triceratops, as we saw earlier. There's that lower jawbone from a Triceratops is much more elongate and has far more rows of teeth stacked on top of one another than that Leptoceratops did. So one of the things that's changing or evolving, being selected for in these different groups of ceratopsian dinosaurs has to do with the structure of their jaws and how they're processing food. Now, Triceratops, again, is perhaps one of the most famous of horned dinosaurs, and it's one that we spend quite a bit of time studying here at the Museum of the Rockies because Triceratops is a very common dinosaur, especially here in Montana. There's lots and lots and lots of specimens of Triceratops that have been collected. And if we could go to the next slide, Jamie, not only are there lots of Triceratops, but we can track down where they're coming from within the hillsides and the rocks. So here's a view again of eastern Montana in what's called the Hell Creek Formation, which is the unit where we find Triceratops and TRex and other creatures. And you can see that this hill has layers, different colored layers of rock. You might see dark brown layers, you might see some bright yellow layers. And basically these different layers of rock represent different layers of time, because the ones on the bottom were deposited before those on the top. So as you walk up this hill, up through the different layers of rock, you are walking up through time. And one of the neat things you can see as you're walking up through the different layers of time in a hill like this is you can compare the fossils found in the different layers of rock and see, what types of animals were living in different times here. And a discovery that's been made regarding Triceratops is that as you go up through the layers of the Hell Creek Formation, as you go up through time, the Triceratops you find look a little bit different. So if we come back to Triceratops here again is our Triceratops with its 3 horns on it's the 2 horns above the eyes, and then the nose horn, the nasal horn above the nose. Now, when you go out into the Hell Creek Formation, if you're in the lower part of the Hell Creek Formation, the lower layers, should you encounter a Triceratops, this is an example of what the nose horn of a Triceratops found low down in the Hell Creek Formation looks like. You can see the nose horn is pretty short, and it's a kind of a short, wide nose horn for this Triceratops. But if we go up then through the layers of time and find a Triceratops from much higher up, we'll find that they look a little bit different. This is the nasal horn, the nose horn, of a Triceratops found really high in the Hell Creek Formation. You can see it's much longer. It's a bigger nose horn. It's more elongate. So it appears that over the course of the end of the Cretaceous period, Triceratops was evolving to have a longer nose horn. Will you pull up the next slide, please, Jamie? This might be an example of what's known as anagenesis on the left side of the screen there, if we could go back a second. So on the left, you see a diagram of what's called anagenesis, which is basically transformational evolution. In that case, you have a population of Triceratops, you say, and lower in the layers of time, Triceratops has a small nasal horn, but then over the course of many generations, the population becomes a species with long nasal horns. This can be contrasted with what's called cladogenesis on the right side of the screen, which is evolution that incorporates splitting or branching events. So how might that happen? Well, if we go back to our wolves and dogs example, imagine you have a big group of wolves and they're living in this one area, and then suddenly they're divided by a big mountain range. It comes and it separates them into 2 groups. So now you have wolves on one side and wolves on the other, and they can't interact with each other anymore. They're totally separated. And say on one side of the mountains, it gets really, really cold. And on the other side, it gets really, really hot. Now, if it stays this way for a long enough period of time, then we might begin to see natural selection take action, because on one side, wolves that are better adapted to cold will have more puppies through the generations and might evolve along those lines, whereas the opposite would happen on the other side of the mountains where it's really hot. And so as they're evolving through the generations, this would be kind of a splitting or branching event in one of these trees. So that if eventually the mountains, maybe they erode away after a long period of time, and these two groups can then interact with each other, they might be so different now that they would be considered different species. So this is just some examples of the details of evolution that we can explore by looking at things like Triceratops and other horned dinosaurs. Now, at the same time as Triceratops, there was another well-known dinosaur around at the same time. This is part of the lower jaw of Tyrannosaurus Rex, probably the most famous of all dinosaurs. And if you remember that diagram of the dinosaurs branching into two major groups, the Ornithischian dinosaurs and the Saurischian dinosaurs, TRex is one of these Saurischians, so the opposite branch from Triceratops and the other horned dinosaurs. But there's a lot of exciting discoveries and research regarding the evolution within the Saurischian dinosaurs. Perhaps one of the most famous fossils is this one. Does anyone have any guess on what this creature is? It's discovered in the 1800s.
Any guesses?
Any guesses? It's kind of an interesting looking thing. When it was first found, if you look at it closely, it has features that look like a dinosaur. Here's the head back here. Its kind of head is thrown back, and it's hard to see because it's really tiny, but it has a mouthful of teeth. It has hands with claws on the ends of the hands, 3-fingered hands. Here's the legs and the feet with claws on them. And here's a long lizard-like tail. So it looks like a little dinosaur. But the really exciting thing when it was found is if you look around the body, there are impressions of feathers. So at the time, feathers were only found in birds. So here's a weird combination of features. It was suggested, well, maybe this is some kind of transitional fossil, some kind of missing link between reptiles and birds. And that was an idea that was proposed, but it kind of fell out of favor for a while until an important discovery was made here in Montana in the 1960s. And that discovery involved finding the animal that this belongs to. Any guesses on what kind of creature this came from?
Take a stab at it. Come on.
It's a foot of, any guesses? No guesses? This is the foot of an animal named Deinonychus, which is a member of a group of dinosaurs that are sometimes called the raptors, which are pretty well known today from the animal Velociraptor. There's a cast of the skull of Velociraptor right here. And Velociraptor is well known from the Jurassic Park movies. But Deinonychus was a big discovery in the 1960s because when it was found, it was recognized that it had features of its skeleton that suggested a far more active animal than dinosaurs were previously thought to be. Up until that point, dinosaurs were usually thought to be kind of big, sluggish, stupid, cold-blooded swamp monsters that just kind of lumbered around and went extinct. But the discovery of Deinonychus suggested a more agile, swifter animal. And it had many features in its skeleton that are seen in birds, very bird-like features. One of the things that's very clear here is that you can see the foot has its 3 major toes that go down on the ground that it was walking on. And it was holding up this claw, but it had three main toes, which you can see in birds today. If you look at pigeons or crows, Deinonychus had very bird-like arms. The wrist structure was very similar. It had hollow bones. Examination of the microstructure of these animals reveals that they had higher metabolisms than dinosaurs had previously been thought to have. And so with the discovery of Deinonychus and other similar dinosaurs, it began what's called the Dinosaur Renaissance. It kind of changed our view of dinosaurs from being sluggish, lizard-like animals to being more swift, active creatures. And then this was, and again, it supported the idea of there being some link between dinosaurs and birds, which found much more support in the 1990s. Next slide, please, Jamie. With the discovery of numerous spectacular fossils in China, like this one here. This is an animal named Microraptor, discovered in China, and you can see the arrows there are pointing to feathers all around this animal's body, around the arms and the legs and on the tail, and then numerous other closely related animals related to raptors have been found, especially in China, that preserve wonderfully exquisite feather fossils. And other groups of dinosaurs also show evidence for feathers. If we go to the next slide, please. This is an animal named a few years ago named Tyrannosaurus, and this is a Tyrannosaur, so a cousin of Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was over 20 feet long, and it was covered in feathers. Now, and Velociraptor itself, even though in movies and TV shows it's sometimes shown with scaly skin, we know that Velociraptor itself had feathers. Because if we could zoom in here, this is one of the arm bones or the wing bones of a pelican. And you see these, there's like little bumps in this bone. Those are places where feathers would attach to the wing of this pelican. And paleontologists have found similar bumps on the arm bones of a velociraptor. So we now know that Velociraptor also had feathers. So, but these dinosaurs, some of them, like the big Tyrannosaur, for example, wasn't using its feathers for flying. So, do you have any idea or any guesses on what these dinosaurs might have been using their feathers for if they weren't flying?
Come on, you have some guesses. What would the feathers be used for if they weren't for flying?
If you're a big Tyrannosaur and you're covered in feathers, why do you have feathers? What are you doing with these feathers?
Wild guesses accepted.
Yes.
I don't know, I think they're taking a nap, John.
No guesses. Well, one possibility is that maybe these feathers were used for insulation.
Or attracting a mate, Annika?
Someone says attracting a mate. That's another possibility. So one possibility is insulation to help them keep warm. Another is that it could have been for some kind of display, like you see in peacocks today, for example. They use their feathers to show off and kind of attract other peacocks, the peahens, so as a display structure. So what we've learned from the fossil record of these dinosaurs is that feathers first appeared and were used for something that wasn't flight, and only later were used for flight, which is kind of neat to be able to see in the fossil record. Now, if we go back to Velociraptor again, here's the raptor skull. You see Velociraptor has these thin, narrow blade-like teeth for slicing up meat. They had pretty long arms, so they're pretty different in shape than what we see in an animal like Tyrannosaurus Rex. Here's the tooth of a big Tyrannosaurus Rex. See, it's really large. I'm going to show you another bone here. Any guess on what bone this is? This is also from a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Any guesses on what part of a Tyrannosaurus Rex I might be holding up right now?
Guesses?
For comparison, here is a tooth. And here's this other bone from a T-Rex. No guesses?
Annika, you got anything for us?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you in a second.
Finger.
It's a good guess. It's not a finger, though. It is small, but it's actually an ulna, which is one of the lower arm bones, like that bone. So imagine if your tooth is bigger than basically your lower arm. And it kind of gives you an idea of the weird proportions of T-Rex. It has these really big teeth, they're really robust, and has these really tiny arms. But if we go back through time and find cousins of T-Rex in the fossil record, they have longer arms and their teeth are more blade-like. So if we go up again through time, we can see the Tyrannosaurs were evolving away from having longer arms to having shorter arms, and away from having blade-like teeth to having these big, robust teeth. So maybe they were evolving to use their arms less for grasping things, and instead were getting better and better at destroying things with their faces. So that's just two kind of examples of things that we can see by exploring the evolutionary record of dinosaurs in the fossil record. And one of the neat things I think that this highlights is the fact that birds today are a living group of dinosaurs. If you look out your window and see birds, they share numerous features with dinosaurs like Velociraptor and Deinonychus, including the hole in the hip socket that allows them to put their legs under their body. And so, in a way, the age of dinosaurs never really ended at the end of the Cretaceous period, but continues to today because there's over 10,000 species of birds, which are dinosaurs, that are still around today. And also, by studying the fossil record and the evolution of creatures, we can see that all living things on the planet are in some way related. Some species are more related than others. You and I are more closely related to other mammals, but we also share features in common with dinosaurs and fish and other creatures. It's just a matter of where we are in this kind of hierarchy of shared features. But all life on the planet is related to one another. And so as paleontologists here at the Museum of the Rockies and at other institutions around the world continue to explore and make new fossil discoveries, we can continue to learn more about the evolution of dinosaurs and other creatures. So that's our presentation on dinosaur evolution.
Right. Friends with shared features, thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. We'll be back in February and hope you can join us then. Have a great day.
Thanks.